Okay, so hi there. Apologies if there's any loud noises behind me. The landscapers are coming through my apartment complex right now. But welcome to the Hunters of Color storytelling presentation session. In this session, we will hear a presentation and then we'll open discussions to a moderated community question and answer session after the presentation is over. So with that, please just add your questions directly to the Q&A box and I will be able to get to them at that part of the session. But our presenter can now begin. Welcome.
Sego, Sewakwego, welcome to Morado and Lydia Parker. Hi everyone, my name is Lydia Parker and I am actually an OSU alum, so I'm very excited for this opportunity to be here today. I pulled out my OSU beads from graduation and I was really grateful when the TK Club reached out and to learn that this even exists. And I'm really proud of everyone for putting in the hard work to make this week happen, the summit happen, and for all the good that everyone is putting into the youth and students and whoever else is involved and in watching these panels this week. My name is Lydia. Like Julia said, I am the executive director of Hunters of Color, and I'll dive into that a little bit more as we move on. But I am a member of the Kanien'kehá Walker-Mohawk band of Six Nations of the Grand River, more commonly known as Mohawk. I'm proud to be Mohawk, proud Haudenosaunee, and I wanted to just start out by acknowledging the land that we're on. If you're in Corvallis, like I am right now, we had our first sunshine in months. So I want to give gratitude for that. Still kind of overcast skies, but definitely grateful to see some sun here in the Pacific Northwest after some much needed rain, but some dreary weather we've been having. But I'm here on the land of the Chepinafa Band of the Kalapuya, and I'm grateful to be a guest on this land and hope to be a welcome guest, as I'm sure many of you tuned in to Dr. Jessica Hernandez's presentation earlier today or have read her book, Fresh Banana Leaves. I think that concept of being a welcome guest or as a guest, as an Indigenous person in diaspora, as settlers, however you may identify, as a guest on land that is not our homeland, our ancestral land. I think it's really important and powerful what Dr. Hernandez brings to the table as far as relationship with the land and with each other goes. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today too, and share some of my stories about elk. So for those of you who live here in the Pacific Northwest, that is something not familiar or not unfamiliar to you, hopefully. And you can see right behind me one of my elk mounts, and this is a story that I'll be able to share with us today, hopefully. And I think that before I go any further, I want to mention that I'm my number one priority in talking about hunting or anything is the respect that we have for nature, the agreement we have for our mother, the earth, as we would say. And I think that as Indigenous peoples, that connection to hunting and the connection to the land and to animals is really unique and really special and something that can't quite be described by Western science or Western knowledge. So I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the elk and why they're important to me and to some other communities that we're working with. So let's dive into some elk storytelling. So I mentioned this guy behind me, and I will dive into a little bit more about why hunting is important personally to me. But before I do, I want to again thank everyone for being here. And I hope that many of you were able to attend Dr. Hernandez's session earlier today. And if not, hopefully you can pick up a copy of Fresh Banana Leaves from a local bookstore, an incredible book, one of my favorites I've ever read, and one that I recommend all the time, particularly because first of all, it made me cry in all of the good ways. It made me cry because it was so relatable in so many instances. Even as Dr. Hernandez is Indigenous from south of what I've heard called the corn line, I think it's so important to bring to light that we are all Indigenous to this land. And the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, I think that it's all something that's worth recognizing that we need to be uplifting voices from what we would consider Central or South American indigeneity. But all that to say, in Dr. Hernandez's book, I won't give away too many secrets because I do want you all to go to a local bookstore and buy it. If it isn't sold out, I know it was sold out most places. But in Dr. Hernandez's story and the namesake of the book, she talks about how her father has a very intricate and special relationship, an intimate relationship with the banana leaves, with banana trees. And again, I won't spoil the whole story, but I so appreciated reading Dr. Jessica Hernandez's words when it came to that relationship and how it is not describable in Western science, how, you know, Western knowledge can't really make sense of it, but it's something that we as Indigenous people have a connection to the land in the way that that banana tree took care of Dr. Hernandez's father. I've seen that in my own life, in the animals that have provided for me and provide for my family, and in my own identity. And so in this invitation to submit a call for abstract, or invitation for the call for abstract, I really wanted to focus on the relationship portion of this week, the summit, with that framework in mind from Dr. Hernandez's book of our relationship as Indigenous peoples to the land. So without any further ado, I'll tell a little bit about this elk behind me. I am a dreamer. I have a lot of dreams, and oftentimes those dreams come true. And I think it's a gift that I've been given in a lot of ways, and they are often related to the land and to nature. And so this elk in particular, we were out hunting on the coastal range, one of my first hunts ever. We were out hunting on the coastal range here in Oregon on the beautiful green, lush, too lush almost, thick, overgrown Kalapuya. Fire science has not been applied here for a long time, but overgrown greenery on the Oregon coast on steep cliffs and hills, if anyone knows the area. And it was exhausting and it was fun. And one night we were camping out on the coast, and I had a dream. And I had a dream of all of these bull elk standing together on this cliff. And one of them then started to slip and slide and fall down this cliff, only to be caught by his antlers. And the dream, of course, was kind of wild and exciting, because you don't usually see that many big bull male elk standing in one place peacefully. And it was almost horrifying and terrifying to see them tumbling down this cliff, these beautiful, strong creatures, this one slipping down the cliff. But I woke up the next morning, and it was about first light when my partner was actually getting out of our tent to go hunt. And I wasn't going that morning, but before he left, I said, "Hey, be sure to keep an eye out for cliffs." And he kind of laughed at me and said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I had a dream about a big bull elk falling down a cliff." And so he said, "Okay." And he knows that I have this gift of dreams and this connection with the land. So he listened to me. And they're actually on bikes. They're biking around on this hunt, but he and his friend, who's Choctaw, were biking on some logging trails and looking for elk. And they came around a corner to kind of a steep drop off. And he said he wouldn't quite describe it as a cliff from what he could see from his vantage point, but his friend was right in front of him on a bike and all of a sudden put his hand up, signaling to stop. And my partner had a new bike, and the wheels kind of squeaked as he came to a halt. But he knew that halt was a good sign that there was something there. So he rolled up slowly. His brakes were squeaking as he pulled up next to his hunting partner and looked up. And sure enough, there was an elk who somehow didn't get scared by the squeak and of the brakes, and was standing there eating 50 or 60 yards away. And I didn't know any of this. Meanwhile, I'm back at the tent by myself. I found a little stream I was sitting in and just enjoying the water and the warmth, the late fall during elk season. And a little bit later, actually a couple hours later, my partner and his friend showed up to the camp, and he had a big smile on his face, and all he said was, "You were right." And so come to find out, when they rolled up on this elk, there was the cliff behind him that they couldn't quite see. And so my partner took a deep breath, asked the animal for permission to take its life, and took a shot with archery equipment, and immediately the animal dropped, which is exactly what a hunter expects and wants in a clean shot and an ethical hunt. But immediately the animal drops, and my partner is so excited, gives it a second to breathe, and gives the moment, gives some gratitude to the moment, and then asks his hunting partner, as he always does, for a break to go thank the animal. And so he always takes time. He goes and lays his hand on the animal and thanks it for its life, which gives us life, and promises to honor him in how we feed our family from there on. And so he went to go do that. And when he went to lay his hand on the elk, he realized just how steep this cliff was. He hadn't even really noticed it from their vantage point where he shot. But he noticed how steep this cliff was. He went to go lay his hand on the animal to say thank you. And all of a sudden it started to slide down the cliff. It started falling down this steep, I don't know what the grade was, but a steep ravine on the Oregon coast. And the only thing that caught it was its antlers. It caught up on a tree on the way down. And so he was able to yell for his hunting buddy to come up. And the two of them took some baling twine that they happened to have and tied his antlers to that tree so that he wouldn't continue to fall as they quartered the meat and packed it out. So when he came back into camp with a big smile on his face and with bags full of meat and said, "You were right," I wasn't quite sure what he meant until he told me the story. But it was just such a almost startling example of the way that nature communicates to us and the way that nature provides to us. And it's something that I often don't share this story in groups where it's not primarily Indigenous folks, because I think that there's almost a misunderstanding or almost a fetishization of these concepts of our connection to the land and to nature. But it's hard not to when we're talking about things like relationship, and we're talking about traditional ecological knowledge. We're talking about experiences and histories that have been passed down for generations and generations. And I know that, like Dr. Hernandez talks about in her book, Fresh Banana Leaves, with her dad's experience, it's a story that if he hadn't experienced it, he might not have believed it himself. And similarly to my dream, when I've told people the story, a lot of times they'll laugh and say, "Oh, sure, that's a fun coincidence." Or, they have to see the picture of the cliff that he caught himself on a tree with his antlers before they even believe that it's a true story. But it was something that really stood out to me. And I was really grateful for whoever it was. My grandma passed away earlier this year. And I know that she's been helping guide me. And I was grateful for her. I've been grateful for others who brought this elk to us. And this elk is part of the reason that we call ourselves hunter-tarian, meaning that we only harvest wild game and procure wild game that way, procure meat that way, which I believe it's a personal choice, clearly, and I'm not here to tell people how to eat. But it is something that I'm very proud of, to be able to have this relationship with animals who live in the wild, who have a sustainable environment, and to be able to work closely with these wild animals, to feel wild and to feel like I'm human in the best way, because it is the good way that we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be in communion with nature. We're supposed to hunt. Our ancestors hunted, at least. And like I said, I'm not here to tell anyone what to do, but I do believe that it's a powerful connection that we have with nature when we're able to be a part of the ecology and part of the ecosystem. And so that's my first story about the elk. And now I'm gonna have to take you a couple hundred, I'm guessing 100, I'm not good at math, but a couple hundred miles down the coastline, still on the beautiful Pacific Ocean, but in Coast Miwok territory. There's a herd of elk called the tule elk, and many people in the conservation space are familiar with this herd in particular because of certain environmental damage and issues that have been caused over the past few years by the drought that all of the majority of the West Coast, but primarily California, has been suffering under the past couple of years. And so the elk in my story were important to me personally, and important to my family, and important to my connection to whoever it was, whoever ancestor, or whoever animal spirit, or whatever it was that led us to the elk on the cliff that day. But the reason I want to talk about the tule elk, this is a Roosevelt elk, by the way, if anyone's interested in species. But the reason I want to talk about the tule elk is because they're also important, and in a similar fashion because they provide food, but also just in more than that, more importantly, for the Coast Miwok and other tribes in California, the tule elk are considered relatives. They are the relatives. I'm not 100% familiar with the Miwok creation story, but I assume that like many of our cultures and many of our understandings, languages are built up around key species. Our identities and who we are as people, how we came to be on the earth, are usually tied to an animal of some kind. Or multiple animals, multiple species. And I believe that is the same with the Coast Miwok. So through our work with Hunters of Color, one of our initiatives is to uplift TEK or ILC, Indigenous-led conservation, traditional ecological knowledge, because we don't see much of that in the hunting side of the green spaces conservation world. And so I think that we're particularly positioned to help decolonize hunting and indigenize conservation work. And those are two of my main impetus for this work. So anyways, my partner's family is from the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay. His mom was born in Venezuela and his dad's family is from the Philippines. So he is an immigrant, a child of a refugee, and he grew up on Coast Miwok and Pomo land. And it wasn't until he and I started dating, when was it, almost 5 years ago? Yeah, 5 years ago in a month, that one of the first questions I asked him was, whose land did you grow up on? And I laugh about it now, but it really is a sad testament. He kind of looked at me and said, my parents? And I told him, of course, that's not what I meant. And that's not a good enough answer. And like every good girlfriend or partner, I send him home with homework. And I gave him a book that I grew up with. I'm not sure where it is now, but I believe it's called 500 Nations. My dad gave it to me when I was little, and told him to do some research and told him to come back and tell me whose land he grew up on. And so he did. He later that night, I saw him reading the book, and he looked at me at one point with tears in his eyes, and he said, I had no idea. He is also one of the co-founders of Hunters of Color, and he helped, part of his impetus was just because he was a hunter. He learned how to hunt when he was young, unlike me, but I'll get into that in a moment. But he learned how to hunt when he was young. He grew up playing on the hills, the rolling hills of the Sonoma and Napa counties. And he would often find arrowheads. And he said whenever he saw them, he was curious, but didn't think much of it. And again, as a child of immigrants, he hadn't really had any kind of family background in understanding indigeneity, understanding the history of Indigenous peoples. And as we all know, the null curriculum, the education systems have failed us in being able to teach our histories, to tell our own histories, our own ways, using our own voices. And so this kid who grew up in the Bay Area, who found arrowheads growing up, always left them where they were because he believed that they belonged to somebody, and they do, and they did, and we should leave them where they are. He wept. He looked at me and cried, and he said, how could I have lived on this place for so long and never had any understanding of who the first people are, who they are, who they were, where they are now, what has happened to them. And he pulled up some of the chapters about the Coast Miwok and the Pomo, and he showed me, this is where I live, this is my relationship to here. And it was really a powerful moment, but it also showed how much work there is to be done, and not that there hasn't been immense strides. I'm so proud of everyone who worked so hard on, I want to say Senate Bill 113 or something like that, but the Senate bill that passed a couple years ago that mandates the teaching of Indigenous studies, Indigenous histories and curriculum in schools here in Oregon. So thank you to everyone, Nyawagoa, for everyone who has done that, who worked on that to make that a reality. And there is so much work to do to make sure that stories are being told by storytellers, culture keepers, and that we are able to tell our own stories in our own voices. And again, I say all of this because I'm positioning us in the Bay Area. Again, some 500 miles, I want to say, south of here, south of where we went elk hunting. Oh, sorry, did I lose you? Oh no. Some 500 miles where we went hunting south of here is the Tomales Bay and Point Reyes National Seashore, where the tule elk live, a distant cousin of the Roosevelt elk up here on my wall. And the tule elk used to be basically all over Northern California. At some point, herds are estimated to be 500,000 strong. And in recent decades, I believe it was by 1887, so in recent centuries, by 1887, after settler encroachment and colonization of the West Coast, overhunting, market hunting, and habitat destruction, the tule elk were thought to be extinct after ranging all the way from the San Francisco Bay Area to the base of the Sierra Nevadas. And they were thought to be extinct. They were found, actually just a small herd, under 30 of them were found by a rancher who, to his credit and to the work of the other conservationists, did in fact help breed and bring back the elk to where there's now an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 tule elk that exist today. However, the elk in the Tomales Bay area and Point Reyes National Seashore live behind a high fence because cattle ranchers have come in and on the National Seashore and on the peninsula where the elk live, they've come and staked their claims on land, on water rights, on water usage. And the proximity to the elk has actually caused the elk to contract Jaundice disease, which is found in cattle, but it's now been shown that it can actually move from species to species, from the cattle to the tule elk. And so a couple of years ago, if anyone has heard of these elk, it's probably because I think it was 2019 that Point Reyes National Seashore was under some scrutiny because the elk were dying. And throughout this drought over the past 7 or so years, the elk have been dying. And it's hard enough to lose any species. Death should be hard, and it is hard. And we should recognize that in any living thing. And even more so, this is one of the only large ungulates native to that region that was almost completely extirpated, almost completely extinct. So a very important and key species just as far as biodiversity goes. But more importantly than that, the Coast Miwok especially consider the tule elk their relatives. They are their relatives. And so it didn't take too much time for us to realize that if we're going to be welcome guests, as Dr. Hernandez's grandma would say, if we're going to be welcome guests, we need to take time to see what initiatives local Indigenous groups are working on, so that we're not coming in as guests on Indigenous land and telling people what we should do. Even as an Indigenous-led organization, there's absolutely no excuse for coming into a land that is not ours, that is not our ancestral land, and telling Indigenous folks what they should do as far as conservation work goes, or as far as other ILC goes. And so we began developing a relationship with a woman named Teresa Harlan, who has become a good friend. She's an elk protector, and some of her friends from the Coast Miwok Council. And we've now developed a strong relationship even past the tule elk, but it began with the tule elk. It began with us reaching out and saying, hey, we care about the elk. We care about what you care about. How can we help? And I share this because I think it's a model that so often is also lacking when it comes to conservation, when it comes to Western science in conservation. It seems to be all too easy for groups to come in and say, hey, we know what needs to be done, and we've done the math, we've done the science, and we want to do this. And so I really hope that what we're doing can be a model, especially to white-led organizations and Western science conservation orgs, to show that there is a right practice, there is a good way to do relationships. And so when we went down to visit Teresa and to meet the tule elk. And like I said, the drought has been really impactful on the elk populations, on the herds. But if you ever do get the chance to go to Point Reyes National Seashore and drive all the way down, it's a windy road, and all the way down to the tip of the peninsula behind the high fences, you're almost guaranteed to see one of the small herds. But as I mentioned, in 2019, and the past couple years in particular, the drought has been taking a toll on the elk. And in 2019 alone, this particular herd, the population was cut almost in half by animals dying of dehydration, animals dying of starvation because there wasn't enough water to create the foliage that they need. And as I mentioned, in and of itself, that is heartbreaking, and it should be heartbreaking. It should be heavy, like any death is. It should be it should be worrisome, like any destruction of biodiversity is. And more importantly, when we met Teresa and we met the elk, I saw how important the elk were to her and her family. Teresa and her partner Tiger and Jimmy and I went and visited the elk behind the high fences, and we got to greet them in a traditional way that Teresa is actually, I believe, Laguna Pueblo in Tewa. And she was adopted by a Coastal Miwok. Her mother's Coast Miwok. And it was beautiful to see Teresa greet the elk in a traditional way and wave after she greeted them. She said, "Hello, my relatives." And I talked to her about this. And I think that it's something that needs to be brought to the forefront of all conservation work, all TEK, all ILC, is that relationship, relative relationship, that these animals are so much more than a game species. I hate the term, but so much more than a game species, so much more than, just a wild animal, but really an integral part of who we are, what makes the land what it is, and how we relate to the land, and understand our identities. And so we got to spend some time admiring the elk, seeing their little, most of them were so emaciated and scruffy. And the good news was, though, there were a few pregnant females. So that was really exciting to see. And at the same time, as I mentioned, with the loss of so many elk, it's been so heavy on Teresa's heart, the Coast Miwok Council's work. And now Teresa has an organization called the Alliance of Felix Cove that I highly recommend everyone support and reach out to and see if you can help, especially if you're in the Bay Area. But it's been seeing that connection made it all more real to me, why the elk matter and why they're so important. And again, to bring back Dr. Ananda's book, Fresh Banana Leaves, she talks about ecological grief. And I've been able to explain, I've used this analogy before, but I was so glad to see her say it as well in her book when she talks about ecological grief, is all of us have lost a loved one. We know that feeling, that pain and that loss. And most of us have lost pets or livestock. And especially an animal, a pet, a dog, something that you just cherish and loves you. It can be one of the hardest things in life to lose something like that, you have a connection to, that's a special animal that you can relate to as another animal and have a connection without ever being able to speak the same language, without ever hearing them say a word. You have that beautiful, special connection. And we've all felt that pain and loss of losing an animal like that animal that's just pure love that either you have relied on or it's relied on you, or both most of the time, right? And so she said it in her book, Dr. Hernandez says, imagine that, but times 1,000. Imagine that pain and loss of losing that animal that's so precious to you, but times half the herd of the tule elk disappearing overnight. Overnight, of course, hyperbolic, but over a year. And I think that that's something that we also need to be recognizing and centering, is that we're not just talking about losing biodiversity, we're losing relatives, we're losing key species that make us who we are. And so there's hope. Point Reyes National Seashore and the National Park Service just closed a public comment. Actually, yesterday we were able to submit a public comment about the elk management, because the current elk management plan at Point Reyes National Seashore was developed in 1998 and it hasn't been updated since. And so along with that, we see exacerbated issues like the outdated policies, but then exacerbated issues like drought that weren't expected and weren't as common in 1998 as we've watched the climate change. And we've seen the impacts of cattle ranching on the national park and in such close proximity to the elk. And part of the initiative that we are hoping to be able to do, and we asked the national park to do, is to take down the fences, is to let the wild spaces, the wild animals be wild, let the animals return to their home. Because it's really, if you think about it, the elk are the native species and the cattle are almost an invasive species at this point, but they're protected now under agricultural laws and stipulations, I'm sure stipends that keep the cattle ranchers there. But something that we're working on is being able to free the elk, and of course, in support of what Teresa Harlan is working on and what the Coast Miwok are asking for. And so I share all of this to hopefully instill some care. I always say you can't care about something you don't know about. So hopefully everyone now has a bit of an understanding of the tule elk positionality along with the Coast Miwok, their importance, and some of the issues that they're facing right now. And our hope is that if we are able to remove some of the cattle from the close proximity, that the Jonas disease will no longer be an issue, so that the elk can then be actually relocated to, and other herds can be started across California, across Northern California, where their range once was, miles and miles from the Sierras to the ocean. But all that depends on not having that disease and not having that close relation or close proximity to the cattle. And I talk about the elk and I bring all of this up because, as I shared in the first story, I'm a hunter. And I come from a long tradition of hunters and a long family line of hunting. And I'm Indigenous, and I come from a family who is removed, tribe who is now actually over the Canadian border at Six Nations of the Grand River, originally from the New York area. And I live in diaspora away from my tribe and away from my family. And so I, like many Indigenous youth, didn't grow up hunting. My dad actually grew up in a city, and like, again, many Indigenous people today, 71% of Indigenous folks are urban and consider themselves urban natives. And I think that shows some resiliency on our part to be able to adapt and change as we have with the land and with nature over time. And it also shows a barrier that we have to our relationships with the land, particularly land that means so much to us. And I've had to explain this to multiple people. I'm assuming that most folks here are Indigenous, so I wouldn't have to explain it as much. But I've had to explain to multiple people that, you know, just because there's reservation land for certain tribes or for recognized tribes, that doesn't mean that land holds importance and critical importance to our identities and understandings. And it's something that I work with a group of educators from my tribe, and I work with other groups across the nation, tribal members across the continent. And one of the things that we notice when it comes to removal from the land, when it comes to living in urban centers, is the impact it has on our identity, the impact it has on especially young people growing up and not knowing exactly who they are, or not knowing traditions, not being raised with ceremony, not being raised in the culture. And so my dad certainly experienced that, which is one of the reasons that I started Hunters of Color, our nonprofit based here out of Corvallis, Oregon, was that he grew up in a city, like I mentioned, and to him, firearms were always seen as a weapon. He still to this day has never placed a hand on a firearm, and I don't blame him from his upbringing. And at the same time, that fear and that experience didn't allow him to participate in hunting at the same rate as the rest of his Indigenous family. And so I've been really lucky to be able to create Hunters of Color with this intentionality to create pathways for Indigenous youth, especially, but all people of color, to be able to participate in hunting through archery, first and foremost, which I believe is one of the most viable ways if you're not interested in handling firearms, which I don't blame you if you're not. But it's one of the most viable ways to participate in the ecology, like I keep mentioning. And also we do, waterfowl and traditional hunting as well. But one of my main goals for starting Hunters of Color was after I had a conversation with a friend who is actually Dene and Tewa. He said that there's a lot of ceremony in his culture for young women or women identifying youth. And he feels that so much of his culture and his ceremony or their ceremony for young men has been lost, or for male identifying youth has been lost in a lack of generational knowledge of hunting. And that's something that stuck with me for a long time, because it is true of my dad, it's true of so many. And I think that given the chance and given the choice to be able to live in ceremony, to have connection to our culture, connection to the land, that we would all do so, whether or not you choose to eat meat, and that's a whole other conversation that we can have some other time. But as far as my understanding goes, we have a understanding with nature, and we have an agreement with nature, and we also have a duty to work and protect nature. And so that's why I started Hunters of Color, because of my love for the elk, my love for people, first people, and all people. And I see that Julia just popped up on the screen, so I'm guessing it means my time is coming up. But I did want to share that that if anyone is interested in working again with the Tule elk, you can reach out to the Felix Cove Alliance, and Teresa Harlan is amazing, land protector working down there. And I'm grateful again to be here. And I hope that if anyone's interested in hunting, especially if you're in the Pacific Northwest, or actually we're in 11 states now, but if you're in the Pacific Northwest, please reach out anytime, and we'll have to get you out and connected to the elk or deer or ducks or whatever it is in your area.
Yeah, no, I'm not here to cut you off. I'm just saying, if anyone has any questions, now is about the time when we start wondering if people have questions, just right for that community-based discussion. So if anyone has questions for Lydia and all of her, you're just amazing. But if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the Q&A chat. We have something in there, but it's not a question right now. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit then, or I guess I can have a question. And it's talking about what you're doing with educators, and talking about, you mentioned the idea of like depression and youth, and what you're doing with work there.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, with educators, it's been really fun. We've been working with some Indigenous folks in New Mexico, actually, to create in-school curriculums. And it's been kind of an uphill battle in some states, but to create in-school curriculums and after-school curriculums with our ambassadors. We have ambassadors that run we call them communities, but they're chapters basically of Hunters of Color, to instill the sense of need to care for our mother, the earth, and to protect the wild spaces that we hold dear. Our goal is to ensure that the next generation cares and loves nature as much, if not more, than we do, and that we continue to have these connections even as we become more urbanized as a population. And so that's one of the ways we're working with educators right now, and always willing to do so in other spaces. It's actually one of my goals. Before I got a degree in history from Oregon State, there wasn't an Indigenous studies minor until, yesterday, the day before. So congratulations to Oregon State for bringing that on. I might have to come back to school. I know but that was one of my goals, was to work with educators, just in storytelling, I guess. But it's really powerful, I think, in our nonprofit. And then as far as depression and things like that goes, there's so much Western science now that corroborates what we've known all along about how good it is to have a relationship with Earth. I was seeing something the other day about how the serotonin uptick when your hands are in dirt, like my fingernails right now, you should see them. The first sunny day here, I've been playing outside in my garden. But there's so much now Western science that corroborates what we've been saying all along about our connection and the need to be outside. The American Psychological Association, for example, says that even 20 minutes outside can help reduce depression. And so our goal, our motto for our nonprofit is "The outdoors are for everyone," and that's what we're sticking to.
Yeah, awesome. So in the chat, they're wondering, there's a question about, do you provide additional hunter training in addition to like state hunter safety programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So here in the state of Oregon, we always, everyone that comes through our program, we have a mentorship program. Everyone who comes to our program, we require that they have a hunter's ed, and they have to have hunting licenses, obviously, to be able to hunt. But our mentorship program is really important because we base it in history. I'm a history nerd. As I mentioned, I have a degree in history from OSU. But we base it in history, we base it in tradition, we base it in culture. We always say we're culturally inclusive, not culturally specific, because I always think it's so silly when people are like, oh, you're an Indigenous led organization, so you're culturally specific. And I'm like, well, there's over 500 recognized tribes in the US and over 600 in Canada, over 300 in Central America. So it becomes so silly to use terminology like that. But we have culturally literate programming built on things like anti-racism, concept of community, and we take people out on our mentorship program, pair them with mentees who've been trained in all of these things too, cultural literacy, anti-racism, and we create spaces where people don't have to be afraid, and people can learn alongside other folks, Indigenous folks, other folks of color. And so on top of what the state does provide, because ODFW, for example, has great training programs, all states have great education programs, but on top of that, we provide almost a further education and mentorship community.
Awesome. Can I put the link to your guys' website in the chat for everyone?
Oh, please do. Yeah, that'd be great. And there's a wealth of information on there on our huntersofcolor.org, or at Hunters of Color on social media. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, of course. And yes, back towards the Native Studies minor, Nino Nache has been working hard on that. We've actually had, this year will be the first year where we have graduates with it, because people have been, this is going to be a thing, so take these classes and we'll
very cool.
Like fingers crossed we'll get it finished before you graduate, so that way but yeah,
that's super exciting. I know, I'm really happy for everyone, and proud to be a Beaver, and grateful for all the teachers that put in all the hard work, and faculty who put in the hard work to make that happen.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions or comments right now? People are just expressing their gratitude towards your presentation and your knowledge sharing. Does anyone else have any questions, or do you have anything that you want to add?
Oh, there's one.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that kind of what I was sharing earlier, the question was, what kind of approaches do I bring as an Indigenous hunter? I think that when I say decolonizing hunting, I'm not just throwing around the word decolonization to throw it around, as it often is. I really mean it, because in Western society, there's this, and Western hunting, there's often this feeling of wanting to conquer nature, or wanting to be above nature. And you see it in the way people carry themselves. You see it in the way people talk about animals. And so my goal when I approach hunting is to do basically the opposite of that, to recognize that I, as an animal, and I, as an Indigenous person, have a relationship with this animal, this Indigenous, this native species for the most part. And it's a mutual respect that needs to happen in order to treat that animal well. And so I briefly mentioned the way that my partner handles giving gratitude, but it's really similar to what I do. And it's not necessarily a tradition from my culture, but it's just a tradition from understanding who we are as people in relationship to animals and to the land. And so I always make sure to give thanks. And to ask the animal for permission. That's one that I didn't realize other folks didn't do for a really long time. But always asking an animal for permission. And you can tell, like I talked about with my elk story, animals and nature do speak to us, and you can tell to take an animal if the animal isn't giving permission. And then giving gratitude in how we eat and how we process animals. We often work with Indigenous communities to give, like, for example, in California, we were turkey hunting last week or 2 weeks ago, and we sent some of the turkey pelts, actually skinned, to some of our friends who are Coast Miwok, so they can create fans and headdresses and gear for ceremony. And so I think that all of those things and more, I could probably talk for a whole hour about what I bring to the table as an Indigenous hunter, but all those things and more, and understanding the reciprocity we have with nature and relationship we have are what I bring when I go hunting.
Awesome, great. There's no other questions in the chat or the Q&A, so please feel free. We have another like 5 minutes if anyone else has any. Oh, there we go. Just had to say it one more time. So Carl is wondering if you work with any northern communities. He's a hunter, fisherman, and gatherer from Alaska. And there's a history of whale hunters with international scientists and conservation organizations. I was just wondering if you worked with northern communities.
Yeah, I'm afraid the furthest north that we get, and thank you, Carl, I love the rest of that too, the understanding relationality. And I think it's important to know too that the rest of what Carl is saying is, to quote, I am seal, I am salmon, I am whale. Because that's what I mean when I say like understanding our identities, right, through these key species. And I think, Carl, Nyawa, again for your question, I think that the furthest north that we're working, where we are right now, is in British Columbia. I'm working with an Indigenous scientist named Ecological, and if you haven't read any of his work, please do. Ecological, I can write his name in the chat for everyone. But he is a young, up-and-coming Indigenous scientist, and he's working up there with caribou populations. But he's been one of the most influential people in my life when it comes to things like blubber, like whale harvest, and like seal harvest, because I know that that's a whole other thing too. I'm sure, Carl, that you're familiar with. Is that pushback on Indigenous people to be able to seal hunt. And I think that so much of that, like even Teresa, when we went down to help and to talk with her about the tule elk, she was so excited that Hunters of Color was going to be working with her as an Indigenous-led organization, because she knew that we hunt. I mean, clearly our name tells it too, but she said that so far the only organizations that have been trying to help her are conservation organizations that are very anti-hunting. And so when Teresa says things like, we need to, make sure the elk stay here and thrive and have space to live for the sake of ceremony, because for the sake of harvest, they get so angry at her. And so I think that there's often that rift that you're mentioning, Carl, between conservation organizations and Indigenous peoples. And it's really a shame. And I think it is white supremacy. I think it's a tool of assimilation to keep us from practicing our traditions. But I'm more power to you. I'm grateful for my cousins from up north. And I would love to help in any way too, if you ever do come across the big green companies or nonprofits, organizations, what have you, that are anti-hunting or anti-culture, really is what it is.
Okay, great. Any last questions before we wrap up? I said that last one and one magically appeared, so I didn't know what to expect that again. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, Mike.
Okay, so I think with that, thank you so much to Lydia and to all of the rest of our speakers today, and also to all of our other wonderful facilitators. You are officially the last presenter for today. But so I think we'll pick up tomorrow at 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I don't know, 8 a.m. on the Pacific Coast. There's actually a White House listening presentation and Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge public listening session where you can actually directly talk to the Biden-Harris administration. So the point of this is to like elevate TEK and federal decision making. And so that will be at 8 a.m. to 9:30 tomorrow. And then we have morning meditation, another keynote speaker, Dr. Dana Wildcat, and then just another packed full day. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time, especially you, Lydia. Thank you so much for coming today. And I think that is it. Y'all are welcome to hop off now. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, well, bye.